Do you know the origin of the phrase, there's a sucker born every minute?
Ooh, is it P.T. Barnum?
It's almost always attributed to P.T. Barnum,
Okay.
but it's not actually him.
Hmm.
People will often cite it like that was his credo, like that's his slogan, but he didn't say that. And I don't think he ever would say that. Like Barnum was a piece of shit for a lot of reasons, animal torture, enslaving disabled people. But one thing he didn't do was sneer at or look down on his audience. But the quote is Barnum adjacent. It comes to us from the story of the Cardiff Giant. Have you heard of the Cardiff Giant?
Yeah, I think so vaguely. It's like famous like anthropological hoax, like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
a fake specimen of a giant or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So basically, in 1869, a New York tobacconist named George Hull decided that he wanted to prove a point about the public's gullibility. So he arranged to have a fake, petrified 10.5 foot tall giant built and had it buried on the property of a cousin of his in Cardiff, New York. So when the huge stone body was discovered, a discovery that Hull arranged by pretending to need a well dug on the site, the giant instantly became a sensation. The landowner put the giant on display and allowed people to view it for 15 minutes at a time for an admission fee of 50 cents a head. Almost immediately, between 300 to 500 people per day were lining up on his property, eager to glimpse the huge figure, which was soon being touted by religious leaders as proof of the Bible. Eventually, the massively popular giant was sold to a consortium of businessmen headed by David Hannum for $23,000. If you convert that into today's currency, that's the equivalent of more than $500,000.
Wow.
Hannum put it on display in Syracuse, where it continued to draw spectators. Even Ralph Waldo Emerson went to see it. All this attention drew the interest of the famous showman P.T. Barnum, who offered Hannum $50,000 for the Cardiff Giant. Hannum refused to sell what he believed to be an important artifact. Barnum, undeterred, did something very characteristic of him. He had a new Cardiff Giant made and began touring what he called the real Cardiff Giant, implying that Hannum's was actually the fake.
Awesome.
David Hannum, of course, was incensed. He sued Barnum, and the two men soon sat before a judge in New York. On trial, P.T. Barnum argued that if Hannum wanted to prove that Barnum's giant was a fake, he had to first prove that Hannum's giant was real. After all, how can you fake a fake? Caddy Barnum just wasn't as credulous as Hannum. He knew there was no way the so-called original Cardiff Giant was genuine, so he knew that Hannum could never validate its veracity. And the judge saw the reason in this argument and ruled in Barnum's favor. Outside the courthouse, Hannum was asked by a reporter what he thought about all the people now lining up to see P.T. Barnum's so-called Cardiff Giant. Hannum answered the reporter, presumably through gritted teeth, "There's a sucker born every minute."
Oh, wow.
That's great, right?
Yeah, that's a much better story than just like circus man hates you.
Yeah, it's great because it's so ironic too. Like Hannum was the sucker.
Yeah.
Like he's the guy who bought into this bullshit giant and he got his ass played by someone who saw through the scam from the start. But it also tells you something about Barnum's perspective and why, again, I insist, he would never say something like that himself. Barnum might chuckle at the idea of authenticity, but he wouldn't scold people for believing or for wanting to believe. He knew that belief was currency, and he knew that belief was something essential and important and ecstatic to Americans. What Barnum sold his audience was not only permission to believe, but also the opportunity to question their beliefs. Forged between the pressures of rational analysis and the burning ecstasy of belief, monsters, like the Cardiff Giant and the Jersey Devil, have always managed to flourish in that country. The United States of America is, and always has been, a land of monsters. Welcome back, I'm Dylan Ferguson.
I'm Sean O'Rourke.
This is The Devil You Don't, Part 4. I kicked that fucking map into the creek yesterday.
What is the Jersey Devil? It's a man wandering into the Pine Barrens never to be seen again. It's a mangled animal found on one of these access roads. Or perhaps it's something that rests within our psyche and we'll never truly understand. All I know is that it's a mystery and it may permanently remain so. What is the Jersey Devil?
It shouldn't be surprising that the first European colonists believed the world in which they found themselves was crawling with unknown creatures, because it was. The continent was massive, and for the first couple centuries, they only knew a few tiny corners of it. So, of course, encountering new animals and hearing stories about the unknown interior made the mind reel and set the imagination working. Like Herodotus, early explorers of the Americas picked up on and embellished the stories they heard from the locals, and this fueled rumors of fantastic beasts in a strange land. Also, strange bones and teeth were sometimes unearthed in the ground, and before the advent of paleontology, it wasn't understood that these were fossilized remains of prehistoric creatures, because until well into the 1800s, the very idea of extinct animals was a controversial theory. In 1705, a colonial farmer found a weird, giant tooth and traded it to a local politician for a glass of rum. The politician gave it to the governor, Lord Cornbury, who had it sent to England, where it could not be identified. Soon, similar giant teeth and even tusks were being unearthed. Some tusks and teeth were presented by First Nations ambassadors to the European colonists as items for trade or peace offerings. These appeared to be the remains of gigantic elephants. Eventually, these fossils of what we now call mammoths and mastodons would birth the study of paleontology. Mammoths were being named and classified before dinosaurs were. But at the time, many Euro-Americans, including both Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, insisted that these enormous creatures were still living, that they were surely roaming wild in the middle of the continent. One reason why the Euro-Americans clung fiercely to belief in the existence of monsters in their world was pride. For as long as Euro-Americans have been self-identifying as their own nation, original recipe Europeans have been condescending to them, treating them as fallen Europeans inhabiting a lesser world. It clearly frustrated the self-styled Americans that the Europeans didn't understand the sense of wonder and fascination that they had for their adopted homeland. The conflict infected the early scientific discourse of the 1700s. One of the most famous scientists of the age was the Frenchman Georges-Louis Leclerc Comte de Buffon, who published a hugely influential multi-volume work called Natural History in 1761. In it, he declared that all animals that have been found on the American continent are merely smaller, degenerate versions of animals found in Europe, Asia, and Africa. He thought the whole continent was a bunch of damp swampland full of small, sickly creatures of no importance. And he said this degeneration applied to the humans who lived there as well, describing the natives as feeble and lacking virility. The many Americans who voiced their fury at Buffon's allegations included Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Adams, but probably no one was as pissed off as Thomas Jefferson. In 1780, Jefferson, then acting as the governor of Virginia, wrote the only book he published in his lifetime, using it to rebut Buffon and defend the prestige of American fauna. He described the mammoth, a name that had been used for the tusked fossils since 1722, as a living beast roaming the American countryside that was, by his calculations, 6 times the size of the African elephant. Then he traveled to Paris with the tanned pelt of a large cougar and arranged to meet Buffon so he could show it to him, to prove that American cats were just as impressive as any lion or tiger. He also asked contacts to procure for him a stuffed bull moose so that it could be sent to Paris and silence the haters. When the stuffed moose did arrive, many Parisian scientists declared it to be a hoax.
That's kind of fair enough. Bull moose is like an unbelievable thing to see for a first time.
Absolutely, yeah. I would probably think the same thing.
Yeah.
So you can see how budding national pride was tied up in this early zoology and proto-paleontology, but the apparent American need to claim that their home was crawling with monsters also became mixed up with superstitious belief in fantastic stories. Well into the 1800s, the belief that there must be giants or monsters of some kind in the American interior proved persistent, and it was never entirely uprooted by scientific rationalism. Stories like that of the Cardiff Giant could catch fire in the newspapers. A lot of Americans seem to really want these stories to be true. Maybe the first American cryptid to become a sensation was the Gloucester Sea Serpent. In the summer of 1817, there was a flood of reports of a giant sea serpent off the coast of Massachusetts, and it became a major story, heavily reported on by most of the big American newspapers, from New York to Boston. It's still not clear what the creature was. Maybe a couple misidentifications created a public panic, or maybe there was something hanging around the coast like an oarfish, which is a flamboyant, elongated, bony fish that can grow to be 36 feet long. The American scientific community of the time showed an eagerness to prove and identify the serpent. Scientists from Harvard and Yale published works about it based on nothing but eyewitness reports, and the Linnaean Society of New England gave the creature a scientific name, Scoliophis atlanticus, based on an apparent juvenile found dead on a beach. The juvenile sea serpent was later revealed to be a common species of snake. There's a reason why American scientists seemed dead set on proving their case. European scientific institutions still didn't take the younger American institutions very seriously. For example, the influential English naturalist Philip Henry Gosse wrote that he couldn't believe in the existence of the Gloucester monster because all the witnesses were Americans, and Americans are prone to lying and are bad at science. In some of the American writings on the Gloucester monster, you can really sense the pique and pride of these scientists determined to prove their snobbish continental colleagues wrong. Probably the best writing on the sea serpent came from David Humphreys, an American Revolutionary War hero who had become a well-known writer and something of a scientist, a fellow of the Royal Society of London. Humphreys went out in ships off the coast of Massachusetts in search of the beast, and while he never found it, that didn't stop him from publishing a book of letters about his adventures, wherein he insisted that the good American men who saw it were definitely telling the truth and the monster was definitely real. Humphrey's writing is very wild-eyed and romantic, and he keeps using the sea serpent as a metaphor for national pride. He thinks the sea serpent rocks, that it's as indomitable as the American nation itself. Let's get a quick little reading from David Humphrey's book.
Who will dare to put a hook in his nostrils, transfix his sides with a spear, or engage in single combat with Vulcanean arms this monarch of the deep?
Yeah, his writing's a great example of what you could call like the ecstatic style in early American writing. Though he was unable to glimpse or capture the beast, Humphreys decides that this uncapturability is actually proof of how magnificent it is.
It must be acknowledged we have but imperfect data for calculating the devious course of such an erratic being, until lately concealed from human view, perhaps for ages, in the dark and unfathomable abyss of ocean, among the unsearchable secrets of the great deep.
Yeah, all caps for the words great deep, which is awesome. Italics and capital letters are just like thrown all over the place. He writes the way like Stan Lee writes a Spider-Man comic.
Yeah, absolutely.
The thing about science in the 1800s, especially American science in the 1800s, is that it was often motivated by wonder. As Michael Petit, a researcher specializing in this period, wrote in a brilliant study about the Cardiff Giant, many spectators understood the giant within the framework of wonder, in which extraordinary objects that seemed to transcend the laws of nature were valued and deemed authentic for precisely that reason. Elite science in the universities had been moving away from wonder and towards demystification. And most histories of science emphasize this institutional work. But popular science, which remained mixed up with humbuggery of the Barnum variety, actively engaged the public's fascination, as well as their critical thinking, allowing more subtle, informal modes of understanding to take shape for the spectators. It's tempting to picture the gawking hordes at, say, Barnum's notorious American Museum in New York or the Ninth and Arch Dime Museum in Philadelphia as stupid and credulous. But they were actually approaching popular science in a more sophisticated and complex way than you might think, and the best promoters like P.T. Barnum knew this. These museums would present a mix of fascinating and important real artifacts blended together with fake bullshit. But the thing is, the spectators knew going in that some of the stuff was going to be bullshit. That was part of the tacit arrangement. Visitors were being invited to actively cognitively engage with the displays by trying to determine for themselves which items were real and which were shams, instead of being treated like children and instructed by an elite authority who you were supposed to unquestioningly trust. They were invited to become participants in discovery, to reflect on what they believe and why, to engage both their criticism and their sense of wonder as they grope to try to figure out how they, personally, understand this mysterious world we've all been dropped into. Later, towards the turn of the century, as we saw when we discussed the nature faker controversy, the debunker skeptic side of science began to definitively win in America. Science as a means to gesture towards the ever-broadening and malleable parameters of perception and understanding largely gave way to science as a referee, strictly enforcing a narrow inbounds field of acceptable reality. For wonder to persist within the landscape of 20th century science, it would need to carve out niches in the disreputable borderlands. The field of cryptozoology is not an American invention. Its origins can be traced to the East Indies-born Dutch zoologist Antoon Cornelis Oudemans Ginzoon, who had the most Dutch name of all time, which I have proudly mispronounced.
That's not a real language.
Oudemans published a book about sea serpents in 1892. But self-identified cryptozoology, the study of proposed, unproven, mysterious animals, was codified as a field by the Belgian-French zoologist Bernard Heuvelmans when he published a book in 1955 called Sur la piste des bêtes ignorées, On the Track of Unknown Animals. Heuvelmans, who was born in Le Havre in 1916, studied biology in Brussels, where he wrote a dissertation on aardvark teeth, escaped from a Nazi prison camp during World War II, became a jazz singer in Paris, then started a new field of study as an armchair naturalist. This was the ideal 20th century life cycle. Oh, and he also served as a Yeti consultant to Hergé during the writing of Tintin in Tibet.
Nice.
Heuvelmans was inspired by Oudemans. I'm sorry about their similar names. It's not my fault. And also the fictions of Arthur Conan Doyle and Jules Verne. But the moment when he found his purpose in life came in 1948, when he read an essay by the biologist Ivan T. Sanderson in the Saturday Evening Post proposing that dinosaurs might still exist in some parts of the world. A Cambridge-educated, naturalized American citizen, Sanderson was born in Edinburgh. His father was a whiskey distiller who was killed by a rhinoceros in Kenya. Sanderson spent years in the Caribbean, both as a biologist collecting samples and as regional head of British counter-espionage during World War II. And post-war, he leveraged his knowledge of weird animals into making radio appearances and publishing articles. Then he got really into speculating about unidentified animals, especially the abominable snowman. Uvelmans actually credits Sanderson with coming up with a term he would popularize: cryptozoology. The two are often said to have co-founded the movement. Cryptozoology is generally considered a pseudoscience. It's not something you can study at Cambridge, say. But by adopting the methods and terminology of hard science, it provided a rationalism-coded way for belief in mysterious things to persist in the new century. In the United States of the 1950s, a period of prosperity and paranoia, cryptozoology really found fertile soil. Its popularity rose in parallel with the rise of science fiction and the belief in flying saucers and alien abduction. By the 1970s, publishing books about cryptozoology, especially the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot, had become a major cottage industry. As for the term cryptid, I was surprised to discover it was only coined in 1983. And I think you can see these cryptozoology books and television programs as a kind of continuation of the spirit of the late 1800s Barnum-style American museums. Like, you open one of these books and you know that some of the stories are going to be fake, and some may be real, and you have the pleasure of engaging critically as a participant trying to sift through the accounts as presented, while also feeling the exhilarating activation of your sense of wonder, a bone thrown into the soft certainty lurking inside you that the world is more unknowable and mysterious than we've been led to believe. Sean, were you into cryptozoology shit, like, growing up at all?
A little bit. Like, definitely fascinated by the classics, like Bigfoot, Loch Ness, Abominable Snowman. And then there's a Richard Gere movie about the Mothman, right?
Oh, yeah, that was cool.
Yeah, so I remember seeing that and being like kind of into that for a little bit, but no huge deep dives. Most of my childhood library time was like taking out books on the Vietnam War for some reason.
All right, so it's probably time we finally brought back our boy, our guy, the Jersey Devil. So reports of devil sightings had continued to burble up occasionally throughout the 1900s. In 1927, he shocked a cabbie who was changing a tire on a lonely stretch of woodland road at night. In 1935, he was spotted trotting down the streets of Woodstown. Probably the most heavily publicized sightings post-1909 occurred in November of 1951 in Gibbstown. There, a child first reported seeing the devil, then a group of teenagers, and in the following days, many locals claimed to have either glimpsed it or heard its screams coming from the surrounding woods. The spate of sightings and press coverage provoked enough anxiety that hunting parties were organized, and the principal of the local school had to call in the chief of police, Chief Silvestro, to try and calm down the children. These newspaper reports resulted in many outsiders trying to visit the small town in the hopes of catching a glimpse of the beast, enough so that Chief Silvestro personally installed a sign on the road heading into Gibbstown that read, "The Jersey Devil is a hoax." These were maybe the most publicized accounts of the period, even if they never reached the fever pitch of the phenomenal week. And yet, year after year, the occasional passing motorist or camper would say they encountered something strange in the woods, and the story stayed alive. But by mid-century, there was a new framework for understanding these sightings. The Jersey Devil had been graduated into cryptozoology. His old name, the Leeds Devil, began to fade from memory, and so too did the origin story situating his roots in the colonial era. Increasingly, the Jersey Devil lived on as an unidentified animal, rather than as a mythical legend. James McCloy and Ray Miller published their seminal book, The Jersey Devil, in 1976, and that's really what solidified its status as a cryptid. A cryptid that now had its own speculative, pseudo-historical, pseudo-scientific book that could be shelved alongside all the other books about Bigfoot and ancient aliens and the Bermuda Triangle and unexplained phenomena that were being cranked out in the 1970s. I think it's hard to overstate how much that stuff really was everywhere in the 1970s, alongside TV series like In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy, constantly inviting Americans, to be honest, mostly teenaged American males, to imagine the borders of their reality as teeming with fascinating, spooky things.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
1970s cryptomania also turned the Jersey Devil, like so many other regionally specific cryptids, into a sort of beloved mascot. The crowning moment of Jersey Devil as regional mascot would come in 1982, when the National Hockey League's Colorado Rockies moved to Newark, New Jersey. Newark is nowhere near the Pine Barrens. It's up north in the orbit of New York City, and many South Jerseyites would rather support a Philadelphia team than something so foreign as a team in Newark. And yet, when a poll was held to determine what the team's name should be, the state's most famous cryptid won out over other names like the Americans, the Colonials, the Meadowlarks, and the Gulls, and won out over the objections of some religious leaders, and the New Jersey Devils were born.
And it's a great name because it combines the folklore of the southern part of New Jersey with the meadowlands here. And also in Webster Dictionary, the devil is described in a very interesting way. It says that it's a person of notable energy, recklessness, and dashing spirit.
Shout out to Peter Stastny.
I also enjoy that now that we have the Seattle Kraken, there are now 2 different NHL teams named after cryptids.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, that's why it's the best league. The other realm of American cryptomania that took off in the 1970s is, of course, the movies. 70s cryptid movies, many of them made-for-TV movies of the week, form a really beautiful body of mostly forgotten work. And a lot of them are really these fascinating, weird documents. We don't have time to go all in on 70s American crypto films. That's a subject for a different podcast. But there is one example that I want to dip into.
This is where the story plays, a world on which we seldom gaze, a page from the book of yesterdays, birds and beasts and wind and water, here beneath the bright blue sky, no man's smoke blinds the eagle's eye, and things that crawl or swim or fly, feed and breed and live and die.
Charles B. Pierce was a man from southwest Arkansas, born in 1938. Starting in his late 20s, he worked at a local cable TV station in Shreveport, Louisiana. He did stints as an art director, a weatherman, and at one point he hosted a kids' cartoon show. Entering his 30s in 1969, Pierce bought a 16mm camera and started his own small ad agency in Texarkana. He filmed farm equipment and made TV ads for a local trucking company, while he supplemented his income by playing Mayor Chuckles on the local television show The Laugh-A-Lot Club. But Pierce had an idea for a movie he really wanted to make, and he was eventually able to convince the head of the trucking company he was filming commercials for to front him $100,000 towards getting an independent production off the ground. The movie he wanted to make was about a local cryptid that had recently appeared in the news, the Fouke monster. The Fouke monster, then unknown outside of a small corner of southwestern Arkansas, is one of the many upright, shaggy crypto-hominids reported to exist throughout the United States. Obviously, everyone knows Bigfoot, aka the Sasquatch, who traditionally lives in the Pacific Northwest, but there are many regional traditions of mysterious ape men in the forests across the nation, including the Florida skunk ape and Louisiana's Honey Island swamp monster. Charles Pierce wasn't sure how to approach the material, so he hung around the small town of Fouke in Miller County, Arkansas, where the sightings occurred. Mostly people were suspicious of him. Maybe because he sat outside the local gas station asking everyone who walked by, "Do you want to be in a movie?" But he eventually managed to befriend a popular local man with the spectacular name of Julius Smoky Crabtree. And old Smoky Crabtree helped put him in touch with other interested folks in the area. Pierce now had a group of locals ready to tell their story, but no real crew to stage a traditional movie with. He decided to work around this shortcoming brilliantly. Charles Peirce's genius was to present the story of the Fouke monster as a pseudo-documentary, blending real interviews with locals, nature footage, and a voiceover narration with staged recreations of monster encounters, refusing to draw a clear line between what was fact and what was fiction. Originally, he didn't want the Fouke monster to be shown at all. Steven Spielberg said the same thing about the shark in Jaws, but like Spielberg, he acknowledged that a few monster moments were necessary. They were staged with the help of some untrained students he recruited and an ape costume he bought in LA and modified by sewing a bunch of wigs to it. But so much of the footage he shot with his 35mm camera had seemingly nothing to do with the project at all. From sunrise to sunset, Peirce would take his camera out into the woods and film the trees and the swamps. He took a canoe out onto the still, shallow lakes, ripples awash in reflected sun, dead tree trunks rising out of the water like silent spires, turtles posted on protruding logs, and he just filmed what he saw. As a southwestern Arkansas man, he knew this land and its beauty, and he filmed it lovingly. Peirce essentially kept shooting this way until he ran out of money and couldn't buy any more film. Realizing that he had all the footage he was going to get, Peirce crammed the reels into his truck and drove all the way to Los Angeles to get it edited. When he got there, he realized he didn't have enough money left to hire an editing house. He was almost at the point of giving up when he finally found an editing firm that agreed to do it for a cut of the finished profits. So the film got pieced together, but there his luck ran out. Peirce thought he could sell the rights to his finished film to a Hollywood studio, but every studio he visited turned him down. He eventually returned to Texarkana with nothing to show for his endeavor, but a movie no one even wanted to screen, much less buy, and a debt for $100,000 that the trucking company boss was increasingly insistent about seeing repaid. He decided on one final swing. Peirce was familiar with an old abandoned movie theater in Texarkana, and he tracked down both the owner of the disused building and a former projectionist who used to work there. The projectionist assured him that the old equipment in the theater was still functional, and the owner agreed to let him use the theater for a $3,500 rental fee. Boldly, Peirce approached the trucking company owner and basically said, "Look, the only hope you have of getting your investment back is if we screen this thing, so I'm going to need you to front an additional $3,500.
Hell yeah.
The gambit worked. Peirce rented the old theater, which was filthy. He hosed down the interior to make it somewhat presentable, and put the word out around town about the world premiere of the new film, The Legend of Boggy Creek. Then, on August 18th, 1972, a movie miracle happened. Texarkana residents lined around the block for a chance to see the film. Peirce knew instantly that he had a success on his hands. The Legend of Boggy Creek caught on like wildfire in the nation's drive-in theaters. And though it was ignored by mainstream critics and tastemakers, it became a minor sensation. There's a lot of uncertainty about its actual box office receipts, but it was likely one of the top 20 highest grossing movies in America that year.
Perhaps he dimly wonders why. Is there no other such as I? To touch, to love before I die. Listen to my lonely cry.
Have you seen The Legend of Boggy Creek, Sean?
I have not. I don't even think I've heard of it. I feel like I need to see it now.
You do. I love this movie.
I'm looking up where I can see it like at this moment.
But the reason why I love it is that it's just a beautiful movie. Like it's breathtakingly beautiful. Like the first time I saw it, I honestly thought afterwards, like, I think that's the most beautiful movie I've ever seen. Like really,
Damn, all right.
the images that Peirce captured of the woodlands and the swamps are just gorgeous in like a painterly way. The colors are amazing. He really seems to see something essential about their objective reality. This man never had formal training as a filmmaker, but you feel prideful care in his technique and his love for this beautiful corner of the country. I feel that this love inspired him to almost instinctively grasp how to wield the camera in just the right way to capture its colors, its ethereal stillness, the weight of the marshy air, the feeling of being alone there with dead leaves underfoot, bird calls in your ears, and a swampy mist in your nostrils. For me, The Legend of Boggy Creek isn't actually a movie about a cryptid. It's a movie about the swamplands of southwestern Arkansas. The cryptid is there as the physical manifestation of the region's unknowable mystery, the sense of something transcendent and strange beyond our ordinary perception. That feeling emanating wordlessly from the woods becomes a kind of fleeting physical presence in the rare moments when the ape beast is glimpsed. So the folk monster is a totally different cryptid from the one we're here to talk about, I know. Even though they're both regional woodland beasts, I'm digressing. But I wanted to bring Boggy Creek into this, and not only because it's one of the signature documents of 1970s cryptomania, because when I first watched Boggy Creek and was bowled over by it, I felt like something clicked for me. Talking about cryptids is a way to talk about the regions we love. The Fouke monster is a manifestation of the beauty and mystery and singularity of the southwestern Arkansas swamplands. The Jersey Devil is the manifestation of the beauty and mystery and singularity of the New Jersey Pine Barrens. If there's a particular patch of nature you know very well, you probably feel very strongly about it in a way you can't quite put into words. Maybe it kind of scares you and awes you, but it taps into a feeling that sets it outside your usual ordered conception of the world. You feel when you're alone there, like you've brushed against something important and unknowable, important because it is unknowable. The realization that we barely know the world we inhabit, the amazement and the fear of that sensation, becomes a real presence when we're out in the woods. Cryptids capture that, or they capture it by failing to capture it through its being uncapturable, because the fact that you can't dissemble that feeling into a clear explanation is part of the spell it casts. And that's wonder. A cryptid is hovering at the edge of perception, not quite reducible to the definitely real, and that makes it the ideal vessel for that feeling. So I regret to inform you that during the cryptozoology boom of the 1970s, nobody made a movie about the Jersey Devil. That fucking sucks. Not even a made-for-TV movie. He didn't even get an episode of In Search Of.
Really?
Fucking Ogopogo got an episode of In Search Of.
That's not even a CRTC rule.
But this doesn't mean that the devil doesn't have a legacy on film. That came in a complicated way later on. Oh, and there was the X-Files episode too, which we briefly mentioned last time. That aired in 1993. Season 1, Episode 5, so very early one. In some ways, the 1990s were just as flush with cryptozoological and paranormal shit as the 70s were, and the X-Files is a great example of that. We mentioned that episode's kind of seedy implications last time, but otherwise it's very light on like actual Jersey Devil mythology. The prologue, set in 1947, does seem to take vague inspiration from the 1927 taxi driver sighting, but that's really it. There's actually no tradition of the devil being represented as a humanoid cannibal in that way, not directly anyways.
Pretty solid X-Files episode. I kept singing just really bad parody versions of Springsteen's Atlantic City to myself throughout most of it. Like, get your pencils out, draw Bigfoot with titties, and meet me tonight in Atlantic City type of thing.
I love the Bigfoot with titties. I love how that Mulder's revelation, that what if it's a woman, just comes from just staring at like a line drawing of what looks to be like the Patterson Gimlin image of the Bigfoot with like the tits outlined.
Yeah. And there's a really great shot, like the camera, you see like his face looking at a piece of paper, and the camera tracks around in an arc to
Yeah.
reveal the titty Bigfoot. It's like, nice.
There are like multiple scenes in this one episode of people just staring very seriously at hilarious line drawings of humanoids. Because there's another one too.
Yeah.
A lot of fun. All right, let's return to the movies. In case you haven't heard, they're back. The first and still most significant Jersey Devil movie came near the end of the 1990s. So in 1996, a young guy from Pennsylvania named Lance Wheeler was waiting for a train in New York on his way back from a music video shoot when he noticed a magazine at a newsstand. The magazine was advertising a piece of hardware you could connect to a computer that would allow you to edit digital film from home. Wheeler remembers thinking at that moment, oh man, I need to get a computer. He and his creative partner, Stefan Avalos, assembled a computer together and decided they were going to make a film for as close to $0 as they possibly could. The movie they ended up making, The Last Broadcast, which ended up costing $900, was pioneering in a couple different ways. For one thing, it's considered to be the first feature-length film shot and edited entirely on consumer-level digital equipment. And it was the first national American release to be distributed and projected entirely digitally, which has since become the norm for American film. It was also the first movie about the Jersey Devil. Like Charles B. Pierce and other aspiring independent filmmakers before them, Wheeler and Avalos felt drawn to build a movie around a beloved cryptid. The 1990s wasn't quite the same landscape as the 70s, though, was it? It's easy today to make fun of Francis Fukuyama's notorious formulation, the end of history. But I think it must truly have felt like that for a lot of Americans in the period between the end of the Cold War and 9/11. The national project of the United States has, in a lot of ways, achieved its goals. They had seized total control over the midsection of the entire continent from coast to coast, and then they proceeded to become the most wealthy and powerful country on planet Earth. They didn't do it without committing countless horrors along the way, but they did it. The American empire of the 90s was dominant, economically and militarily, but also ideologically and culturally. And that gave Americans a cocksure sense of certainty, as well as a kind of tired fatalism, a sense that everything was now mapped and settled, and nothing would meaningfully change. The period's popular art was dominated by arch-knowing postmodernism, the who gives a shit slacker ethos, and ironic meta-narratives. A lot of the biggest movies took it for granted that the audience was blasé and detached, somehow too sophisticated and over it to take anything seriously. So with The Last Broadcast, when we finally got a Jersey Devil movie, it was in some ways a Jersey Devil movie that might have pleased the writers behind the winking, sneering newspaper coverage we saw during the phenomenal week of 1909. It was a Jersey Devil movie that didn't actually believe in the Jersey Devil. Which isn't to say that The Last Broadcast isn't interesting. Wheeler and Avalos, like Pierce before them, decided to create a pseudo-documentary that blurs fact and fiction. Except it wasn't a loving catalog of a region and its people, it was an artifact of media fatigue. They present the film as a documentary about a documentary, an attempt to piece together what happened to a group of amateur filmmakers with a local access cable show who wandered off into the woods hoping to film the Jersey Devil, or rather hoping to pretend to film the Jersey Devil, and ended up mysteriously murdered.
On December 15th, 1995, Stephen Avcast, Locust Wheeler, Ryan Clacken, and Jim Seward headed for the Pine Barrens of New Jersey to do a live broadcast in search of the Jersey Devil. Jim Seward would be the only one to return.
Sean, I asked you to watch The Last Broadcast to prepare for this episode. Mm-hmm. What do you think about this movie?
I like it. I really enjoy found footage kind of movies just in general. I think The Last Broadcast is good. I was like certainly expecting more of a Jersey Devil movie rather than a lot like the X-Files episode, sort of using the Jersey Devil as a machine to talk about other stuff.
That would be terrible. That's a terrible crime. Imagine that. Using the Jersey Devil as a machine to talk about other stuff. Awful.
Yeah, who would?
Who would dare?
But I really like it gets extremely 90s doing the meta documentary and having it be about fame and media. Without like spoiling anything, there is sort of a tonal shift to it that takes away from...
I'm going to spoil it. Go ahead and spoil it. Because we can't talk about it without spoiling it. Come on.
Yeah, in the last 15 minutes of the movie, we shift to like a third-person perspective, and it sort of gets away from the diegetically interesting thing of like found footage of who shot the footage and who found it and why, and kind of making all that. There's a shift of tone that's a little bit jarring. It doesn't take away from the movie, but it's quite surprising to make it just about people, right? Like about the documentarian.
Mm-hmm. I think fittingly for a movie that literally represents a medium's first step into the digital age, The Last Broadcast is in a lot of ways, it's about a world struggling to adjust to the dawning reality of the internet and accessible amateur video. I think it's very 90s in the way it depicts the idea of authenticity as something that's been hopelessly lost in an ever-mediated, increasingly abstracted landscape of pure, placeless, deracinated information, misinformation, distraction, and reaction.
Fact or fiction? I don't believe the fiction. I think that this is a person, and I'm going to find out who it is. I'm going to reconstruct and do my job to recover what has been lost. The facts.
It is as though the Jersey Devil is a monster reborn in a digital age, reborn on the internet. A demon captured on IRC logs, mangled video, whispers in the dark. It is to these that I look.
It's sort of framed as a murder mystery, initially presenting a man who's obsessed with both magic and the internet as the likely suspect. It only briefly toys with the idea that the devil itself is a suspect. And maybe it's inevitable that the final reveal is that the real villain is the documentarian framing the film. Which is kind of to say, like, the media did it.
Yeah.
As this journey nears its end, I begin to fully understand the essence of what this is about. The media upon which these events were recorded, the media that should have been able to provide a truth more pure than ever before, has somehow become the story. This has become more than a search for the truth behind the fact or fiction murders. It has become an indictment of truth and how it is viewed through the lens of the media.
Like, the media we're awash in is corrupting, misleading, and evil, and also omnipresent and omnipotent. Like, it's all bullshit, but it's the only reality that exists at the same time. To me, that's like a very classic representation of late stage American 90s brain. It's very skeptical of the screens we use to interface with the world, but even more skeptical of the idea that anything more real exists beyond the screen.
Yeah.
So there's a good chance you, listening, have never heard of The Last Broadcast. Wheeler and Avalos shopped their movie at Sundance, but it never screened there, denying it a chance at indie movie glory. But it did end up playing on a number of screens across America, and some around the world, and it's said to have grossed like $4 million, which is obviously a tiny bit of work for a film that was made for fewer than 1,000.
Yeah, $4 million on a $900 budget.
Yeah, it's a good turnaround.
That's insane.
Lance Wheeler, continuing to stalk the vanguard of digital media, has gone on to make projects incorporating virtual reality, transmedia, escape rooms, artificial intelligence, and David Cronenberg. The Last Broadcast, which I think is still clearly the most important Jersey Devil movie, despite not having a Jersey Devil in it, continues to enjoy a modest legacy as a technical landmark, and in some circles, as a kind of postmodern cult classic. But if we're being honest, The Last Broadcast's biggest legacy is defined not by what it is, but by what it isn't. Because it's very hard to encounter a reference to The Last Broadcast that doesn't also reference the elephant in the room, the Blair Witch Project.
The Toy Story to its small soldiers.
Which is understandable. If you've never heard of The Last Broadcast before, there's a good chance you listened to me describe its plot and thought, oh wow, that sounds like the Blair Witch Project. Broadcast comes out in 98. Blair Witch comes out in 99. Did Blair Witch rip off The Last Broadcast is a question that tends to loom over discussions of the earlier film. In fact, if you buy the DVD of The Last Broadcast, you'll be greeted by this quote on the front cover, credited to IndieWire. May have influenced Blair Witch, ellipsis. It certainly preceded it.
Yeah, that's some great praise.
Yeah. Sean, we have already done a podcast together where we dug into the history of the Blair Witch Project on Mind Over Splatter. We touched very briefly on The Last Broadcast, and having researched the origins of Blair Witch, I was pretty dismissive of claims that it was in any way influenced by the earlier work. Basically, Blair Witch was shot in October of 1997, and The Last Broadcast's first screening was in March 1998, so no influence should have even been possible. Having read more about it recently, I do have to acknowledge that the broadcast heads have a slightly better argument than I gave them credit for. Basically, they point out that when TLB was being shopped at Sundance 98, it was being misleadingly presented as a real documentary, and maybe that strategy was influential for the creators of BWP, who adopted a similar approach at the following year's Sundance, when Blair Witch got a midnight screening slot and became a sensation. But Blair Witch's creators, Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez, had actually been using a similar blurring fact and fiction strategy to present their film to potential investors since as early as 1994. So, yeah, I still don't see any possible influence, either on the film or on the strategy. I think bottom line is that a similar idea occurred to two somewhat similar young filmmaker duos at the same historical inflection point that provoked similar musings and anxieties. But one work that absolutely did inspire Myrick and Sanchez was The Legend of Boggy Creek. They both loved that movie, and they both loved the cryptid episodes of the 70s TV series In Search Of. Maybe they even found something to like in that fucking Ogopogo bullshit, who knows? Myrick and Sanchez were disgusted by the state of horror movies in the 90s, which tended to be winkingly comedic and postmodern, pandering to the audience's self-assured knowingness without even pretending to be about the things that actually unsettle us. And they looked to these works of 70s cryptozoology mania, fondly recalled from their childhoods, works that blurred fact and fiction as a guiding light. Well, both students at the University of Central Florida's film school, they bonded while talking about how Boggy Creek and In Search Of, instead of reassuring the audience that they are media savvy, put them on unsteady, uneasy ground, unsure of what is and isn't truth. Splitting us from our confidence, these works allowed a deeper horror and a fascination with the unknown to actually penetrate. The Blair Witch Project was also a small-budget independent film, though not to the extreme extent of Avalos and Wheeler's $900 nano budget. And unlike The Last Broadcast, it not only secured the coveted Sundance screening, it springboarded off it to become a literal global sensation, one of the top 10 highest-grossing films in America that year, and it had an outsized influence on the future of horror cinema. In the 25 years since, countless American horror productions have been chasing that dragon, trying to recapture the terrifying magic that came from the sense of something uncanny glimpsed through a shaky camcorder.
Yeah, how many Paranormal Activity movies are we at?
No one knows. I think it would probably feel cool to take the position that The Last Broadcast is the real overlooked masterpiece, and that Blair Witch was cheap catnip for the masses that stole its thunder. And some people do take that view. But I can't pretend to agree with that. Ultimately, for me, Blair Witch Project is a much better film. Despite having less on-screen philosophizing, it takes its themes to a deeper, truer place and embodies them concretely. Blair Witch isn't about the Jersey Devil per se. It's not literally about any actual cryptid. Myrick and Sanchez made up their own legend from whole cloth, then seeded it online, tricking people into believing it was a long-standing tradition. But by creating a legend of a mythical being out in the northeastern woodlands, in an area both close to major urban centers and surprisingly remote, with roots in the colonial era, Myrick and Sanchez created a legend so similar that it might almost be about the Jersey Devil, just shifted a bit to the southwest. The main character of the Blair Witch Project is Heather Donahue, also the actor's real name. Heather's a fascinating character for me, one who's extremely 90s in the way she relates to the world around her. She prefers the comfort of viewing the world through screens, not because it's more real necessarily, but because it's real and also not, and she seems to think this is truer than any phony notion of authenticity.
I see why you like this video camera so much.
You do?
It's not quite reality.
Reality says we gotta move.
No, but it's totally like a filtered reality, man. It's like you can pretend everything's not quite the way it is.
She also thinks simply having a map will guarantee that she can't get lost in the woods. So much of the movie involves who gets to interpret the map, who has the map, where's the map? Oh my god, where's the fucking map?
We're looking at the map, we're gonna find this the best we can. I can totally find this. This is where we were. We're going more or less this way.
Heather, give me the map. Turn the camera off. Give me the map.
Turn the
camera off and get us home. Give me the map.
The map is in my pocket. You're gonna have to wait a second. You wanna see the map?
God damn!
Shush. If we keep our heads together, we'll be just fine.
Are you happy?
I'm not happy, no. I don't have it. We have to go. I'm serious, I don't have it.
Are you fucking serious?
Fucking serious, I don't have the map, okay? You guys were online and me about the map, were you? Come on, seriously, if you have the map, I just want to know that you have it. That will just make me happy just to know that you have it.
Heather.
If I know that you have it and I can at least see it, I will feel much better.
You know what? I kicked the... I'm sorry, it's fucked up. It's fucked up, but I kicked that fucking map into the creek yesterday. It was useless. I kicked that fucker into the creek.
Most interestingly, Heather doesn't believe you can even get lost in America in the 1990s.
It's very hard to get lost in America these days, and it's even harder to stay lost, so we have that on our side. What?
Well, we're doing a pretty goddamn good job of being...
Not possible. Not possible in this country.
Why is it
not
not
possible.
possible?
Because this is America, and it's not possible. We've destroyed most of our natural resources. Let's just keep going.
America.
Obviously, this is fucking wrong. As the unlikely persistence of the Pine Barrens shows, America has remained full of big, wild woodlands, and there are countless regions in the country where you can very easily get lost, including some close to major cities. But I think Heather's mindset reflects America's self-image in the end of history period, as a place that's somehow finished, all settled, all mapped. That it's become nothing but maps and images on screens. The Enlightenment rationalism and the science and technology that it bred had reached their final dominance through broadcast media, and the resultant belief that everything is inescapable media in America now, with nothing more real behind it. See, the 1990s wasn't just a victory lap for the Euro-American project. It was a victory lap for the narrow rationalism underwriting the Euro-American project, one that saw the world as solvable, controllable. Once they achieved global dominance, many Americans seemed to want to say, see, now it has been solved. Now it has been controlled. Now the mystery and uncertainty has been banished, just as we always told you it would be.
twilight's last gleam.
Except the real still lived on in a way the screens and maps can't deal with, right? The woods are still there. And so are their legends. So are their spooky, significant, hyper-real ways of viewing the world. And this is why Blair Witch is so much better than The Last Broadcast to me. I think of The Last Broadcast as the kind of movie that Heather Donahue might have made.
Yeah.
Blair Witch is a traumatic film because it's about the trauma of being brought into communion with that other deeper sense of reality beneath the mediation and interpretation. We've been tricked into thinking that that kind of reality is gone. We've been anesthetized into disbelieving it. But then someone chases the legend, enters the woods, and there it is. Pure and horrifying, irreconcilable, uninterpretable. Something we'll never control, never put into a labeled box. And it never left. Do you agree, Sean, that The Blair Witch is better than The Last Broadcast?
Yeah, it's... Yes. I think it's a pretty easy pick. Story-wise, it's a little bit more cohesive, like story and theme. It's The Last Broadcast is like, oh, cool ideas and curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
But The Blair Witch Project is, I think, something that like stands the test of time a little bit better. Like I'll still revisit that movie and really enjoy it. And it still feels like interesting and fresh to me.
Yeah. I think it's telling that both The Last Broadcast and Blair Witch are movies without a single definitively supernatural event occurring on screen. But the difference is in Blair Witch, you leave the theater shaken, absolutely convinced that we have witnessed something supernatural. The trauma is entirely delivered by the idea. In that way, it goes further than Boggy Creek did. It embodies Pierce's original idea, the idea that the cryptid doesn't even need to physically be there. All right, so are there any Jersey Devil movies that have an actual Jersey Devil in them? There have been a few straight-to-video ones in the 21st century, but not much worth dwelling on. Maybe the most notable one is 13th Child from 2002, which I think is the first movie to actually depict a Jersey Devil on screen. It's done with practical effects, and we get kind of a gooey demon reminiscent of both the alien xenomorph and the Pumpkinhead designs.
Nice.
That title, The 13th Child, might make you think, oh, cool, they're going to do like the Mother Leeds origin story.
Yeah, right away.
They don't, but they do include little bits of Jersey Devil legend, but in kind of a remixed way. They say that the creature is the 13th child of a Lenape shaman. So they kind of change it up.
Yeah.
For some reason, the movie was co-written by aging one-time Oscar winner Cliff Robertson in the twilight of his career. This was the same year he played Uncle Ben in Spider-Man. And he also appears in the film as a mysterious figure who both looks and sounds uncannily like an American recordings era Johnny Cash.
Oh.
One thing that's cool about it, though, is they actually film it in the Pine Barrens. You see some places like Batstow Village, which are, will be familiar if you've, spent too much of your time recently researching the Pine Barrens, say. There's also, after that, Carney from 2009, which is one of the countless creature features produced by the Sci-Fi Channel. And that has a CGI Jersey Devil that looks kind of like a beefy cross between a giant bat and like a humanoid pit bull. Very light on mythology. And it's not actually set in New Jersey, unfortunately. But what's interesting to me is that its plot, the devil has been obtained by a circus as an attraction, but escaped their clutches and is now wreaking havoc, is kind of similar to the fake origin story of the Australian vampire that Norman Jeffries sold to the press in 1909.
Oh yeah, little Easter egg.
Potential source of inspiration, I don't know. The best part of it is that it stars B-movie icon Lou Diamond Phillips. So that's always a pleasure to see LDP.
Our king.
Yeah. He plays the small town sheriff. And I feel like LDP has played so many small town sheriffs.
Yeah.
He probably just shows up wearing his own wardrobe at this point.
Yeah, it's just easier.
Yeah. So returning to the Blair Witch Project, it also dipped its toes into the looming digital age, as the last broadcast had, but not through the medium it used, but through its marketing. Myrick and Sanchez foresaw how these meaningful legends were going to increasingly be transmitted in a way uprooted from their associated geography, pooling instead in unreal eddies formed by the transmission of information. In the 21st century, the world of cryptids has, in fact, as they predicted, definitively moved into the online realm. Any updates to the undying legend will happen online and in YouTube videos and TikToks, in those corners of the apps that cater to spooky events caught on camera. New videos of the Jersey Devil continue to be uploaded and discussed from time to time for those inclined to pay attention.
If you hear that sound you just heard in that last clip, you do not want to go towards it. People suspect it being the Jersey Devil. Recently, people have been hearing and seeing signs of this demonic
creature. There have been
creature.
over 200 sightings of a demonic creature named the Jersey Devil, and many believe that this spawn of Satan has lived in New Jersey for nearly 300 years.
It is commonly described as a kangaroo-like creature with the head of a goat, leathery bat wings, horns, and a forked tail.
Jersey Devil is a legendary creature said to inhabit the forest of Pine Barrens in South Jersey.
New Jersey's urban legend is actually a pretty common one. Most people know it, even if you're not into urban legends.
Some even say this is a real trail cam picture of it. Have you seen it?
Many of these videos are blatantly hoaxes, or deer, but their acceptance shows how undimmed that need remains to seek out the uncanny, to feel both the chilling whisper of the traumatic real and the mind-opening sense of wonder that comes from believing. One sort of myth that you can find all over TikTok these days is one that feels almost heartwarmingly familiar for a student of American cryptozoology. Once again, giants are now being spotted all over America. Despite our reliance on almanacs and maps, on algorithms and screens, the land itself and the effect it has on us will always be something we have to reckon with. The land bloomed with fresh monsters when we tried to plant Enlightenment rationalism in its acidic soil. Ben Franklin's attempts to mock the lead's lack of scientific rigor gained unexpected purchase in the sugar sand, and later aggressive attempts at applying an advanced rationalism to the humans there grew into eugenics, an anti-mystery stance that became anti-human once it inevitably resulted in more superstition. But though they emerge from superstition and unease and fear, at the same time, we see how the creation of these cryptids is a way to hold on to a figure representing the mysterious allure of nature that both repels and attracts us, while speaking to something deep within us. Charles B. Pierce's fascination with the Fouke monster was clearly a way to address his love of his beautiful region. And later, Blair Witch shows how, for a postmodern audience, an encounter with the loamy real represented by the forest is felt as trauma. Didn't we defeat this? Didn't the Enlightenment win? Why is this still here? So a lot of you probably walked into this Jersey Devil podcast thinking, are they going to say it's real or not? But I think, thanks for sticking around, by the way. But I think in cryptozoology, like with religion, the question of belief only gets more slippery the more you try to pin it down. The lines between the touchable provability of a thing and the idea of a thing begin to blur, as does the distinction between believing in a thing and wanting to believe in a thing. Well, there's definite pleasure in being an atheist pit bull chasing down the untruths of an idea in an attempt to squash its possible corporeality. There's also a pleasure, maybe even a greater, purer pleasure, in trying to convince yourself of the reality, of the undisprovability of a fantastic, improbable thing. We want there to be things outside our grasp and understanding because we know that there must be. Ultimately, cryptids aren't things we keep alive because we fear them. They're things we keep alive because we love them. We love them because they're vessels of the mysterious, numinous qualities of the world that our words and our maps and our science will never capture. Fighting to limit our understanding of the world to the understandable is limiting. As massive as what we can circumscribe within the boundaries of the provable is, it will never feel like enough because it can't possibly be. And trying to delimitate and enforce that boundary can have truly evil consequences. Like nature itself, cryptids are something we were once afraid of that we're now also afraid of losing. Because something essentially American and just essentially human does continue to live in those pines, despite Philadelphia and Ben Franklin and rationalism and international capitalism and the turnpikes and the Wawas. Because how could it not? Daniel Leeds knew it, just like the Lenape knew it and the Pineys knew it and Agent Fox Mulder knew it. The occult, the myths, they gesture towards something that you can't outline with clear strokes. The Jersey Devil, of course, will never actually appear, but it will always be there. It's Daniel Leeds. Daniel Leeds became the Jersey Devil. It was done by his detractors and those who opposed his son's attempts to continue the family legacy, and it was done without his permission. But if he could reflect on his afterlife today, I'm not sure he'd be upset by the new form he took after his death. He might find it appropriate, even beautiful. He was turned into a monster, but in that form he became a vehicle for the sense of searching wonder that had animated his life. And in this mysterious form, he became a way to help transmit this feeling to others, a way more effective and powerful than any of his attempts to use the written word, that deceitful medium he both loved and found frustratingly inadequate. As a cryptid, he became an emissary for the persistent, essential, not totally describable ways of seeing the world that he had always loved and advocated for. Ben Franklin tried to ridicule it. Scientists and journalists tried to discredit it. Goddard and the eugenicists tried to literally kill off the people who kept it alive. But the Jersey Devil, like the Pine Barrens and its resilient residents, will always be here. Because the Jersey Devil represents something that, in Daniel Leeds' words, no pen can or ought to write or tongue declare. Okay, I'm going to end it on that. Guys, thank you so much for sticking to the show until the end. My name's Dylan Ferguson. I wrote the show.
I'm Sean O'Rourke.
Thank you so much, Sean. Really appreciate you doing this with me.
Thank you, Dylan. This was amazing.
It was a lot of fun for me. If you want to hear me yammer on about other subjects, you might want to check out my show about horror movies called Mind Over Splatter. I'm currently co-hosting a show about reality TV called Bravo Outsider with Craig Midwinter. By the way, Sean makes the occasional cameo in both of those shows.
Yeah, always a good time.
Sean O'Rourke, everyone, the man with the velvet voice. You're hearing it more and more. There'll be contacts in the show description for those who want them. You'll also find my principal sources listed in the episode descriptions. Original music is by the very talented Rob What. Thank you, Rob. There's a link to his work in the description, too. If you like the show, and if you made it all the way to this point, I assume you did, unless you were hate listening to it, in which case, respect, honestly. But if you did like it, obviously I appreciate it if you help us reach more people by liking, subscribing, commenting, sharing the link, all that stuff. I did want to dedicate the show to my brilliant friend, Justin Wagray. I hope you would have loved it. special shout out to the Microbrasserie Tadoussac, where I wrote almost all of these scripts. The staff there, you guys are such lovely people. It totally makes up for the fact that your beer is terrible. And if you really like the show, tell us if you want us to do it again. I'm not planning to do more, to be clear, but if people asked for it, I wouldn't rule out a sequel. The Chupacabra, Mothman. Just don't say Ogopogo. Yeah, Skunk Ape. That'd be a good one. So if you do want to hear more, let us know which cryptid you would like to hear about, or which cryptid you would like to hear about things that are barely tangentially related to it. Look, if you stuck around this far, that's what you freaks want, I'm going to have to assume.
Just incredibly interesting, and now I have 10,000 wiki tabs to go through.